Since 1993, the UFC has enjoyed a meteoric rise, taking a sport that was outlawed across a majority of states and turning it into one of ESPN's core products. In fact, to say the UFC has changed the reputation of MMA and the industry surrounding it is an understatement. While it is not the first mixed martial arts fight promoter, it is undoubtedly the biggest, selling for an incredible $4.025 billion in 2016, the largest sale of a sports franchise in history. If nothing else, the UFC has done great work in bringing recognition to incredible talents that would have otherwise gone unnoticed. Think Ronda Rousey, Jon Jones, Khabib Nurmagomedov, Silva, and the notorious Conor McGregor. So, how did it all happen? This is the story of how the UFC revolutionized MMA. As always, thank you for choosing Bet the Fist, your home for mixed martial arts analysis, law, and more. Want to take your gambling profits to the next level? Bet the Fist MMA is dedicated to providing quality analysis, statistical data interpretation, and positive EV bets for absolutely no cost on our website at www.betthefistmma.com. Without further delay, let's get back to the video. Changes to fighting guidelines. The UFC is credited with bringing some much-needed fighting guidelines in MMA that gave the sport the legitimacy it lacked before. And let me just give you a little perspective here. Back in the day, anything, and I mean anything, was legal in MMA. The sport adopted a no-holds-barred style of fighting, which essentially means little to no rules during the action. In other words, you could use any manner of tactics. Think groin shots, headbutts, and hair pulling, and the same could be used against you. Is that all? Well, you wish. There were no weight classes either, meaning you could be matched with a much larger and stronger opponent. Remember David and Goliath? That's more like it. The fact that fights were not regulated or refereed effectively didn't help either, resulting in more of a street brawl than a professional sport. Not to forget, you couldn't don gloves, and there were no time limits. Now, being so violent in nature, it was only a matter of time before people would start speaking out against the sport. Former Republican Senator John McCain was easily one of the biggest and highest profile opposers of the sport, and just hear this, it didn't even take long for him to dislike it. Within a few seconds of being shown a video of the early barbaric UFC fights, McCain was adamant that everything needed to be done to end what he termed human cockfighting. He would then write letters to the governors of 50 US states, reasoning with them to outlaw the UFC. Time would pass, and soon, some 36 states would agree with McCain's idea of outlawing no-holds-barred fighting, the style UFC was then popular for. This was a wake-up call to the UFC, because it would soon start changing its fighting guidelines to align with the specifications put forth by state athletic commissions across the US. Among other rules and regulations, the UFC would implement weight class and downright outlaw things such as fish hooking. Gloves were also introduced, specifically to minimize the profuse bleeding fighters experienced during fights, and the unsightly image audiences were treated too. Kicks to the head for fighters on the ground were also done away with. More changes would be made over time, including banning hits to the back of the neck and the back of the head, hair pulling, and headbutting. And more significantly, time limits were put into effect, meaning the sport would have 5-minute rounds instead of endless fighting. Now, these and other changes helped the UFC and MMA at large immensely, catapulting them into the mainstream without losing the thrill of fusing martial arts and combat, structure, and centralized leadership. There is no denying that UFC had achieved considerable success in its early years, especially among hardcore fighting enthusiasts, but it would take the leadership of 3 guys, Frank Fertitta III, Lorenzo Fertitta, and Dana White, who bought the company from its original owners in 2002, to turn it into the worldwide sensation it is today. Dana White, the current UFC president, actually managed a few UFC fighters then, but he believed the company had much more potential. The 3 would turn the company on its head and put together a new, better structured UFC that did a lot in helping give MMA legitimacy among the greater public. They also changed the structure of the competition to mirror other combat sports, most notably wrestling and boxing. New championship belts were introduced, and multiple fight nights throughout the year became a thing in UFC. In case you don't know, only a single night of fighting was originally held before the trio stepped in. What's more, the The new owners set up their headquarters in Vegas and hired people worldwide to scout for talent and organize events, transforming the UFC from a backyard brawl promoter to a global sports enterprise, breaking down gender stereotypes. While women were already participating in MMA for some time, there was no division for them in the early UFC. So, in 2012, the new UFC would start a women's division, leading to even more growth in the MMA industry. During the announcement, graced by Dana White, Ronda Rousey was unveiled as the first female athlete. Now, if you have been keeping up with UFC, Ronda needs no introduction. She is a hugely influential figure in MMA and played a significant part in establishing the women's division on a high note. And since the beginning, the women's division has only improved, gaining much popularity and attracting more women to MMA. And thanks to this success, women have similar opportunities as male fighters, going as far as headlining pay-per-view events and often generating more hype than the men's fights. Pay-per-view success. It goes without saying that the UFC's clever use of the PPV model really revolutionized MMA, both from a popularity and revenue perspective. When speaking of revenue, 2016 easily stands out. Despite the UFC selling more than 40 fights in person, a significant chunk of its profits, 42%, came directly from PPV sales. As we speak, the UFC partners with more than 60 broadcasting firms globally and streams in more than 40 languages to give it more appeal to the masses. Beyond that, PPV sales numbers are an excellent way for the UFC to draw insights into the fighters that people want to see in the ring. Conor McGregor is an excellent example here, and it's no wonder he's featured in 5 out of 6 of the highest-selling UFC events, including the highest-selling one, UFC 229, Nurmagomedov vs. McGregor, which had 2,400,000 PPV buys, equating to about $180 million. As a result, it comes as no surprise that McGregor is currently the UFC's highest-paid fighter. Commitment to the health and safety of athletes. The UFC has taken numerous steps to enhance the health and safety of its athletes over the years, and let's just talk about some of them. Back in July 2015, the UFC joined hands with the US anti-doping agency USADA to launch a historic and revolutionary anti-doping program. With this move, the UFC gave the USADA the green light to independently perform random tests on all fighters throughout the year, whether during the season or on breaks. USADA personnel test athletes for performance-enhancing drugs and other banned substances, thus encouraging and guaranteeing fairness in the competition. While we are on this, it's important to mention that the UFC has actually gone a step further and adopted one of the strictest PED testing strategies worldwide on its own. With this, the UFC has become a leader in ensuring fair sports and fighting doping. Now, what else has the UFC done to enhance the health and safety of fighters? Well, the UFC has also built a new global corporate campus in Vegas that includes an industry-defining UFC Performance Institute. The point: to deliver the world's best MMA training facilities to support the scientific development of fighters and coaches, injury prevention, treatment, recovery, and rehabilitation of professional athletes. Not to forget, the MMA promoter signed a partnership with Cleveland Clinic and gave a $1 million contribution to continue its support of the professional fighters' brain health study. This study intends to develop ways of identifying the earliest, most subtle signs of brain injury in athletes exposed to head trauma. Moreover, it seeks to enable the identification of athletes who are more likely to develop chronic neurological disorders. Branding. Everything the UFC has been doing, from drug tests to changing the game's rules, is meant to improve its image and give it wider acceptance. And to further establish its brand, the UFC introduced the first ever athlete outfitting policy and UFC Fight Kit in 2015. This meant fighters and other people involved with the company had to start donning branded apparel created in partnership with Reebok, UFC's exclusive global outfitter. So far, this is working well and has really improved the sport's image. Most of all, It has given professional fighters a consistent uniform they can train and fight in, so they can ensure they have adequate range of motion, breathability, and a professional appearance. Do you agree that the UFC has elevated the sport of MMA? Yes? No? Give us your thoughts in the comment section below. While you're at it, give us a thumbs up and subscribe if you think Paddy the Baddy lost at UFC 282. In our next video, we'll be talking about how a multi-billionaire became mixed martial arts' biggest ally. Know who it is? Find out next week on Bet the Fist MMA. Thanks again, and good night.